Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zubko. The rapid advancement of technology in the field of military systems has introduced a pivotal shift in the way warfare is conceptualized and conducted. Among the most significant innovations are autonomous weapon systems, which often operate without direct human intervention in a decision-making process. These systems, often powered by artificial intelligence, have sparked intense debates within both academic and policy circles, not only due to their technological implications, but also because of the impact on international norms and ethical standards in warfare. My guest today is Professor Ingvild Bode. Hello?
Hi.
Ingvild Bode is a professor of international relations and director of the Center for War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. She is principally interested in analyzing processes of policy and normative change, especially in the areas of artificial intelligence in the military domain, the use of force, AI governance, United Nations peacekeeping, and more general dynamics of the UN Security Council. We want to speak about the autonomous weapons today, and this topic is very, very crucial because in some way it goes in a shadow or shadows of other disciplines. So I'm very glad that Professor Bode accepted the invitation. And let's start with the first question. And I want to ask about the motivation. What motivated the creation of the AutoNorms project? And which specific theoretical and empirical gaps in existing research does it address?
Yes, Martin, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Just to clarify at the beginning, AutoNorms is a project funded by the European Research Council. It has now been running for 4.5 years. And I think that as we know about projects, right, so you already start writing the application 2 years before you actually start the project, right? But my main motivation really was kind of both theoretical and empirically there. So on theoretical terms, as you said, I've been long fascinated by the study of processes of normative change and how norms, which I understand quite broadly as understandings of appropriateness, how they shape international politics in fundamental ways. So how norms underlie, right? So what states and other actors consider to be appropriate behavior. And I think this is, of course, has been a core focus of norm research in international relations, which is also where I kind of located myself in. But I found that when it comes to these kind of new technologies, which are really embodied by autonomous weapon systems or by AI in the military domain more broadly, that kind of international relations has kind of a problem, right, with technology in a sense. So it has for a long time not really looked that much at technologies or not really looked into how the dynamics of technology might also have a normative impact, right? So, and this is kind of a deviation in other social sciences where technology has been a crucial focus, right, for a couple of decades. And I think IR has only kind of woken up to technology as something that should be studied more comprehensively, maybe over the last 10 years, I would say. Some of the main motivations here was also for me to investigate to what extent autonomous and AI technologies and weapon systems could also shape international norms, especially those norms governing the use of force.
And why do you think there was or there is that gap between the technology and IR? Is there any preoccupation with other disciplines or topics, or is it just that we need more scholars who are interested in technological advancement?
I think it's a dual thing. So on the one hand, I think it's not that IR theories, like the big IR theories, the isms I'm talking about at the moment, that they ignore technology completely, but it's more like something that is kind of that stands apart from the core theoretical arguments that they're looking at, right? So if you look at realism, for example, of course, they would say technology, certain technologies in warfare can be instrumental, right, in terms of advancing your position of power, but then they don't really look at that technology specifically or how that technology could also have looked otherwise, or the, like these kind of design aspects of the technology and how this maybe was shaped in different ways and how this then led to a particular outcome, right? It's more kind of taken as a given, right? So I think And that's not something that only I would kind of mention. There are other kind of technology scholars, and I will also say that, right? So I think that's one part. And then I think over the last couple of years, maybe especially with the integration of AI into world society more broadly, there's been more attention paid to, in broad terms, how technology is political, right? And for some social science scholars, that is not exactly news, right? But it is sort of new in the IR context. And so I'm talking here especially about kind of theories based in science and technology studies, right, to really investigate technopolitics, right, and kind of the enmeshment of technology and political relations. And I think that is a very exciting kind of area to focus on for IR. If we want to grasp fundamentally, right, so what these technologies, such as AI, but also others such as quantum or cyber, what they really mean, right, for international politics.
I know there is a specific website dedicated to this project. Can you please tell us for how long this project is going to be, and what do you consider as the main outcome of this project?
Yes, so the project has started in 2020, so in the summer of 2020, very, very different times. And it will run until 2026, so the summer of 26 it will finish. So it was it's so 6 years in total. And the outcome really are the academic publications associated with the projects. And these have come in a variety of journal articles, also in a book that I co-authored with another member of my project team. So I think the project has a distinct academic focus on really advancing kind of this intersection between norm research, practice theories, and the study of technology. But then the project also has kind of an interest in making these kind of academic findings valid or relevant for policymaker audience, right? So we've also written policy reports, policy briefs. We submit evidence, right, to calls by international organizations, and try to also kind of ensure, right, so that that our findings are not just relevant for academic audiences, but actually also, applied to the policy discourse.
Yeah, I think that's quite useful to clarify because when you have those military oriented projects, people might think that you are developing something behind the door. So I'm glad that you clarified that. The project investigates how autonomous weapon systems might influence and reshape international norms, governing the use of force. That's basically the main idea. How do autonomous weapon systems challenge existing norms formation, those processes, and let's put it in a systemic sort of global security dimension?
Yes, I think that basically we can look at two sets of norms that are being shaped by autonomous weapon systems. I would say also more broadly, the term autonomous weapon system always kind of implies, as you also said in your introduction, that there are systems that are kind of used completely in the absence of human control, right? But actually, most of the systems that we see in use today, and also maybe for the foreseeable future, are systems that have kind of some kind of human control involved at some kind of level, right? So I like to usually talk about the integration of autonomous or AI technologies into weapon systems, So just to clarify that we're not just talking about systems that are completely outside of the human control chain. And I think that we can think about two ways, as I said, about how the development of these systems shapes national norms. So the conventional way would maybe be to look at how, in kind of using these systems and developing these systems, core principles or norms of international law, such as, for example, of international humanitarian law, kind of change in terms of how they are interpreted. So the substance of that might change. And of course, given that international law is always kind of inherently ambiguous, right? This is also kind of part of the deal in a sense. Of course, there should be certain boundaries that are not to be crossed, right? But it's international law also has to be flexible to a certain extent in order to be adaptable to different situations and historical contexts. But I'm kind of very interested, especially in the norm on the human role over the use of force, or the human control over the use of force. or generally how this integration of AI and autonomy in weapon systems and military thinking more broadly changes kind of what type of control humans can still exercise over decision making, over the use of force. And for me, that is really the crucial norm that I have been tracking with the AutoNorms project, you know. Initially, right, so there was this kind of fear that with autonomous weapon systems we would completely lose control. As I said, most of the cases we see there's still kind of humans in or on the loop in these systems, so kind of having to authorize the release to use force. And that somehow is reassuring, right? But then at the other hand, I try to kind of look more closely at what does this norm of human control actually mean, right? And this is then where I get to these kind of looking at these practices of designing and of using these systems that have shaped the content of this human control norm.
When you study international regulations, norms, all those things around, do you come across any military or war theories? Because some people might ask, are you like researching this from that perspective that on one hand you have the rules specifically established by the United Nations or other international organizations, but also some people might ask if that weapon system like hardware is doing its thing or what it's supposed to do. Is there sort of like the radical algorithm, or is it like based on more international dialogue, or how does it work? Because I think this is a very interesting moment, and I would like to clarify that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you take one of the foundational international legal texts in this area, so the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols, right? So this is really the foundational text of international humanitarian law. Then that is kind of then of course every nation state would kind of have particular kind of rules of engagement, right? Depending on the particular warfare type of warfare that they are conducting, right? And also then kind of going along with that doctrinal ideas about how to implement these concepts, right? And I think the basic idea of international humanitarian law is, of course, as we know, the balance between military necessity and humanitarian considerations, right? And the law is kind of there to ensure that that balance is maintained, right? So that military operations are not too excessive, right? But then how precisely to maintain that balance is really down to these particular rules of engagement and particular national doctrines, you know. So I think they go along, and I think usually if we kind of expect state actors to act in some kind of good faith, right? So they will not ignore international humanitarian law. But we have seen, of course, that there are significant differences in terms of what is tolerated and what is acceptable in terms of military necessity if we compare different states' rules of engagements and different national doctrines.
Yeah, I ask this question also because when you speak with scholars, some of them they understand international law differently in the Western world and in different parts of the world. So when you speak with someone from India, New Zealand, South Africa, there are different perspectives. The next question is also a very interesting one, and I'm interested in why is it crucial to analyze norms as through practices and social interactions? Why we just don't do a top-down sort of correction in regulations, and we can basically do a slightly adjusted document, establish the new document, or accept some new rules, and that's it?
I mean, I think there are two reasons. First of all, it's not that easy to establish a new document. And this is kind of the space where we have been for the past 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of topic of autonomous weapon systems has become a subject of international debate for almost 10 years now. And as we see, there's no new law emerging from this process as of yet, right? So there have been some kind of soft law principles, maybe we could call them, right? But there's no legally binding international law emerging from this process. Of course, and but still, this has been the focus of norm research so far. You would look at these kind of international debates, look at how particular actors frame maybe the necessity for there to be a new international norm, right? And kind of see, okay, is this to some extent then, does this become part of soft or hard international law? and then what happens afterwards, right? In the sense is, do states actually adhere to that norm? Do they comply with that norm? And I think that's an important part of the normative picture if you want to understand where new norms come from. But I think it's just one part of the picture. So I think norms also work in very different ways. And I quite like to talk about the notion of a social norm here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that norms can also be kind of implicit, right? So they cannot be really kind of publicly discussed, but that doesn't mean that these norms don't actually guide behavior, right? So and I really think that these kinds of social norms originate in practices, right? And quite often originate outside of the kind of the public space of discussion, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that we typically monitor when we try to look for new norms. So and I think I mean the basic idea is that these kind of processes of how states design, for example, new weapon systems, right? How they train personnel for using these systems and how they then use these systems, that these kind of patterns of use or practices then also shape norms, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, norms are also always quite. It's not necessarily something that is inherently positive. I think we also sometimes have this idea that if we talk about the norm, this is a progressive norm, right? So like human rights, so this is a kind of something that advances a certain agenda, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think norms, for me, of course, they have this element of normativity, so they encapsulate particular ideas of oughtness and of justice, right? But they can also be associated with the process of making something normal and therefore acceptable over the course of repeating a particular type of practice over time, right? So I think this kind of normative and normal dimensions of norms are quite important, right? And we shouldn't kind of think about norms as something that is maybe inherently aligned with our particular ideas of justice, right?
You mentioned social notion of norms or notion of social norms. Can we clarify what does it mean and maybe one example for those who are not 100% sure?
Yeah, I mean, I like to use an everyday example for social norm because I usually talk about these things in the context of delivering a presentation to a room with an audience, right? And then I say that everybody in this audience is usually then, and at that moment, following a whole host of social norms, right? So, which means that I'm speaking, the audience is listening, they don't interrupt me usually, right? So they basically adhere to a particular idea of appropriate behavior, right? A social idea of appropriate behavior, right? So that when you're sitting in a presentation setting, you're listening to the presenter, right? So you wait until maybe there's a Q&A session. That is basically a social norm, right? That you're following there. And I think that much of our life is kind of structured in this way, right? And I think it also applies to technologies and to kind of weapon systems.
We also mentioned that the project AutoNorms is focusing on practices. And also, let's give one example. What practices and what does it mean in real life? Because when we say practices, it might mean many things. So let's specify a little bit more. Which practices are you researching?
Yeah. I mean, for me, practice is a way of saying and doing. So that's quite a broad definition, or a pattern of doing something, social pattern of doing something in a social context. And as I said, so a practice for me is, for example, a practice of designing a weapon system in a particular way, right? And this can be quite technical. So if you think about, for example, designing a weapon system that integrates automation and autonomy, right? So then if you want to have that system being able to recognize particular types of objects, for example, military objects, right? Then you would have to program a particular target profile, right? So kind of what's this kind of what falls into that target profile and what falls out of that target profile. And these kind of choices are all done via practices, I think. So I mean, for me, practice, and I think that depends a bit on your ontological positioning, but for me, practice is something that is everywhere. The whole world is made out of social practices, right? But of course, whether you find that convincing will depend on where you stand, what your theoretical foundations are, right?
Absolutely. I have one difficult question, and that's how does emphasizing bottom up norm development problematize rationalist and institutionalist understandings of global governance and security regimes?
I think the key is how in terms of how practices work, right? So And I mean, practice theories really come from sociology, you know, so you have thinkers such as Bourdieu, Lahire, you know, de Certeau, who are associated with this kind of program, right? And the idea is always that practices are quite often, I mean, first of all, they're incremental, right? So they lead to something incrementally changing or continuing, and they're often non-intentional, right? And I think that and that kind of non-intentional dimension is for me quite interesting, right? So we might have norms building up as the result of all kinds of practices being performed in a certain way. And maybe all of the people or actors who performed these practices never intended things to be a certain way. So it wasn't necessarily a big strategic plan behind this, you know, that that would then lead to a particular norm taking shape, you know. But still the unintended outcome of all of these practices being performed in a certain way is de facto a certain norm. So just to illustrate that, because I know it's quite abstract, you know. So, and I think that's what's happening with the human control norm, right? So on the one hand, most states agree, right, so that we have to retain a form of human control over the use of force, especially when using these autonomous or AI technologies in weapon systems. So that is kind of more or less a consensus view, right? But then to me, it really depends on how does this work in practice, right? And if we look in practice, even with kind of much older weapon systems, such as, for example, air defense systems, so that already integrate kind of predecessor technologies, right? So like automation and autonomy into the targeting decision-making process. So in air defense systems, you always have a human operator who is kind of monitoring what is kind of going on, and then the system would basically display certain types of targets, right? And then the human operator has to decide yes or no, right? So do I attack this target or not? So very clearly there's a human on the loop, right, who has to decide, right, prompted by the system, whether to attack or not, whether to release force or not. And in some ways you would say, okay, these systems then comply, right, with the idea of human control because there's a human on the loop. But if you actually look a bit more closely at what that human is able to do and how that that kind of role of the human is structured, then certain doubts start to arise, right? So whether that human is actually in a position to make this kind of critical, deliberative judgment that we think that he or she should be making, right? And one of the key concerns is, for example, that that through the integration of these automated or autonomous technologies, you have a significantly reduced time span to make decisions. That's also one of the reasons for why militaries are so interested in using these technologies, right? So it increases decision-making speed. But from a human perspective, that means you have very limited amount of time to even make that decision to say yes or no. So even in these kind of old air defense systems, you typically have a couple of seconds to decide yes or no, right? And of course, then you can ask yourself, is what is happening there really a form of meaningful human judgment being exercised, right? And then also the whole way that that in integrating these kind of automated systems into the performance of the human role, that also has meant significant changes to what kind of things these human operators are actually doing, right? So whereas they would maybe have been more active or occupied more active roles when they had to do some of these kind of analytics and kind of going through the data themselves. Now they're basically just kind of passive supervisors of the autonomous automated system, you know, and that also kind of decreases situational awareness. So basically, the long and short of it, right, is that these changes that I think have happened through these practices of how states have designed, for example, in this case, air defense systems, have led to actually the human role being kind of diminished, right, over the use of force, kind of being reduced. But this was not an intentional outcome, right? So it was never the case, you know, that that any state developing these systems and using these systems kind of decided, okay, if we do that, right, so that will mean this and that for the human, you know. But it's just an outcome of the practices.
That's very interesting to listen to that, because I think this also prompts you some more debates about sort of research implications or maybe new research ideas coming from what you just said. So that's just to close this theoretical chapter of the interview. Some people, some students might ask, do you have any sort of ground theory approach to your research? Or you are doing social norms and critical research in some way?
I mean, I would say, if pressed, I would say I'm broadly constructivist, but I also I think about theorizing in IR in kind of quite different ways. So I think I see theorizing as quite a creative process that has evolved a bit away from the big debate about the grand theories, right, to more this kind of mid-level type of theorizing. Um, and where I think IR has been quite good historically to draw lots of inspiration from other disciplines, right? But I mean, I think the basic fundamentals, right, are definitely within constructivist types of thinking, right? Because this is also where norm research finds itself in, you know. But I mean, also in the way that constructivism, as we know, right, is not a kind of a fully fledged theory, right, but more like a set of assumptions, right, that are can be quite flexible, right. But at some point, I'm also thinking I'm kind of pushing away from this a bit, you know, and I would generally always advise my students to be quite to try to be creative with the theoretical arguments rather than thinking about theory as something that is kind of there ready to be applied, right? To think about theory rather as something that you can also creatively work with, right? That you can make yourself, right? Rather than that has to be made for you by an established scholar.
Each research needs some data and some base to research basically something, because if you don't have any data, you are hardly going to research anything. So let's speak a little bit about methodological approach to the project. And I'm interested in how you collected or are you collecting data. That's the first question. And the second question is this methodological approach, how it empirically traces the evolution of autonomous weapon systems related norms. Are you going more to the history and you have data from history, or you're doing different style of research design?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mixed approach. It's kind of deeply qualitative and interpretivist. So kind of follows these kind of general ontological and epistemological lines, you know, which I think is quite important. But then it has kind of it's using kind of diverse methods that kind of all originate in the basic problem: how do you access these practices, right? Because the idea, especially with these kind of social norms, is that it's not just kind of as easy as kind of looking at a track record of statements, you know, although of course that is part of it, you know, but that will not get you enough material, right, to understand the underlying processes, especially if these processes are not performed in kind of a public space. So, I mean, we use a number of methods. So, for example, one of the initial ways of was building a kind of building different data catalogs of existing weapon systems that integrate autonomy, AI, or automation, just to get an idea of what is the current state of development, you know, because I mean, I think that's very important just to have an empirical grasp on what can we know. Of course, being aware of kind of the limits of open source data in this context, right? But I think we were actually able to document with regard to three different systems quite closely, you know, like what is the state of development and what is precisely the role of the human in these systems, you know. So that was kind of one part. And then I think the other kind of crucial parts are interviews with or a range of experts. And these can be academic experts, military personnel, right, civil society representatives, government officials, everybody we could get our hands on, basically, who are representing these different practices within the states that we considered, you know. And then also we did a lot of participant observation. So we went to these kind of different meetings where autonomous weapons are on the agenda, for example, at the UN headquarters in Geneva. And because that only, of course, there you can kind of follow and get a sense of where's the discussion actually heading. And if you're doing that over a number of years, you get a very good sense, I think, how the positions of states change and shift, you know. But also what is very useful about these kind of meetings is that not just kind of what happens publicly, but then you always have these kind of breaks and kind of spaces where you can talk more informally to the participants, right? And I have found, or also members of my team have found this to be one of the most productive ways of gaining insights into practices, right? And kind of how people think and how people experience certain things. Because I think quite often we find, due to the high amount of secrecy in this kind of space, that not many stakeholders are maybe inclined to agree to a formal interview, but they are happy to kind of talk to you over a hot beverage of their choice, right? Kind of at the margins of these meetings, right? So but of course, from a researcher perspective, that has the problem, right? So that you can never kind of use these conversations that you have as direct sources of data, right? Because they are not part of they are not kind of formally collected in the sense, so that they that you have the consent from the research participant, to their statements being on record, So so I mean, there are all of these difficulties, I think, attached to doing research in this space. But I think over time, it's also kind of building these kind of relationships and networks that allows you to gain access. Because I think, I think all of these methods depend on you securing some kind of trusted access, right, to people who have kind of the information about practice or can reflect on these practices.
And this is also a very important thing to know that all people who are doing security research, and especially with the sensitive topics like this one, they usually get email, this is top secret, this is confidential, I can't talk about this. So that sort of confidentiality is a very crucial element of research. And I think the research community can understand that. But for people who are outside of this community, when you face that something is top secret and you go to some meetings, how people understand the necessity to share information with you? Do you have mostly positive experience, or for you as a researcher, it is really demanding to get access and at least to speak with someone?
I think I have had more positive experiences, and I think that has to do with a number of factors. I mean, one is that I think within the context of the project, it's so there was also somehow you at some point I also became kind of an appreciated interlocutor for some of the policymakers, right? So because I think so as I first started studying this topic in 2017, so that was quite early. And then I think lots of people, for lots of observers, also policymakers, this was quite a remote topic, a bit science fiction in nature. But of course, over the past couple of years, we've seen much empirically, right? So how this topic became much more salient, right? And became part of the kind of the news cycle. So there was a lot more attention paid to that. And that also meant, right, so that if you had a certain expertise on the topic, right, you would be seen in kind of a different, more positive light, if you know what I mean, right? So because many states were also at this point just kind of trying to wrap their heads around what precisely their position should be, right? So I've seen, especially maybe since 2022, or maybe even starting before, a lot of these kind of expert meetings convened by kind of think tanks, by international organizations, by civil society organizations that would bring together governmental, academic, industry experts, right? And then you would be participating in this meeting. And for me, these meetings are also an important source of data in a sense, right? Because usually these meetings are organized under Chatham House rule. So in the sense that you can, just to explain this for listeners not familiar, right? So that you are able to kind of use potentially information from this meeting, right? But you cannot associate that with a particular person who attended this meeting. So you cannot reveal the identity of anybody who was participating in this meeting. But of course, these meetings have been very helpful for me to get a better sense, or an evolving sense, of how different practitioners' positions kind of evolved with regard to this topic. So Yeah, but at the same time, I think the growing salience has also meant some new challenges that were not the case when I started the project. So, for example, to do with Russia's war in Ukraine, right? So, and with a greater sensitivity towards anything related to China, also in terms of research, So that has also meant I had to rethink some of the ways that I was approaching potential research participants, and for kind of safety reasons, right? Both of them and of my research being seen in a particular maybe negative light.
You selected interesting group of countries. China, Japan, Russia, and the United States as principal country cases. There are two questions about that. Why those countries and what's the significance of their norms or norms development? And the second question, some people might ask why there is no European country, especially when you are from southern Denmark.
Yes, actually, that's a good point. I mean, the reason for the three big countries in the selection, China, the US, and Russia, was really at the time of writing this application. If it came to kind of who's investing most in developing military applications of AI, right, or kind of developing weapon systems that have autonomous or AI functionalities, it always came down to these three countries in terms of the scale of investment and the expected future investment, right? And in terms of kind of how this technology was mentioned in kind of strategies and these kind of documents, right? So I think these three were always kind of singled out as the kind of the edge, right? Having the developmental edge, and because my project is so focused on these kind of practices of developing these weapon systems as being fundamental for how these systems then shape norms, So that's why the focus was on what I expected to be significant developers of these systems, rather than, for example, some European cases, Yeah, because I thought, okay, maybe they will have the most impact because of the scale of the number of systems that they would be developing and using, right? That doesn't mean that, of course, other countries don't also play a role, but maybe a comparatively less pronounced role. And then kind of Japan came in because they have a significant robotics industry, kind of very, very known for that, right? And my project, or the AutoNorms project, is also trying to track not only what kind of happens militarily, right, but also saying that there is a clear connection, right, to how these technologies such as autonomy and AI are developed in the civilian space, and how that might then spill over, right? We also have to track these more kind of industry civilian practices, right, as well, to understand this kind of trajectory. And I think it's always, I mean, there's always a limit, right, to to how many cases you can tackle in the context even of such a big project.
And is it possible to compare how advanced is debate about norms and autonomous weapon systems in those countries that you mentioned? Because basically you are independent researcher, because you are not citizen of those countries, and you are in a completely different territorial area. So I'm interested in like Russians, Chinese, Americans, how they understand the debate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to get a full picture, and I should also say, right, so that the way that the project was structured was also based around a division of labor, right? So in the sense that there were different members of my project team, or there are still different members, right, who are in charge of different country cases, right? So because one of the fundamental ways of kind of trying to access these emerging understandings of appropriateness in the context of Russia and China, of course, has to do with actually being able to speak the language, right, and be able to follow and also be familiar, right, not just with the language, but with the whole way that the societies and the politics in these countries are structured, right. So the two people, actually, there were two different postdoctoral fellows who were working on the Chinese case, right, who both who were both fluent in Chinese, right, and could kind of follow these kind of these debates and understandings, right, and the same was for Russia. I think For the Chinese case, what I think is quite interesting is that maybe contrary, right, to what many people think, yeah, namely, right, so that China doesn't care about ethics, basically, right? So and that there's no interest, or there are no actors within the Chinese political system that would be advocating for potential downsides or kind of limitations or risks attached to AI technologies in the military domain. This is actually not the case, right? So we have a debate that shows some similarities in terms of, for example, if you kind of unpack the Chinese state, so if you don't take it as a unitary actor, but actually look at kind of different societal groups and different kind of like from kind of economics and industry and defense, you see actually that there are these kind of different camps almost, right? So that also share a lot of similarities with some of the discourses or debates we see in kind of Western states, so that there's also a fundamental worries, right, about risks attached to AI technologies, about whether they're actually as functional, right, as intended, whether they are predictable, right, so whether this can actually work, right, whether technology actually works, and also kind of risk associated with these kind of failures, so that you can see quite clearly. In the Russian context, it's much harder, or it has been much harder to get any kind of comprehensive overview because of the lack of access, right? So because I mean, originally it was planned that the researcher who was in charge of Russian case study would go to Moscow for a field study that was planned for spring 2022. You can imagine that this didn't happen. And of course, since then, the only thing that we have to analyze, right, is kind of what is kind of published in open kind of source statements, or what you can get from kind of defectors, right, or kind of interviews with kind of Russian experts in abroad, right. And they, of course, they're not connected to what is kind of currently going on anymore, So there's always this. I think it makes it very hard for the Russian case to distinguish between what is officially said, right, and also how advanced, for example, Russian capabilities are, and what is actually going on, right? Yes, and I think that, but we're not alone in having that particular challenge.
Absolutely. And I think also many people, they have some sort of slightly naive imagination that if someone is scholar and expert, this person has automatically access to the latest development and all those materials. Because, for instance, in Russia, there is a long tradition of closed cities. So when in Russia they are researching or developing something regarding military or nuclear capabilities, it's usually happening in closed cities where nobody can basically go. You can't visit and ask questions, and this is a tradition. That's how the things work. So I'm glad that you clarified this, because it's quite important for people to understand that sometimes research has limitations, that even with the goodwill and very polite access and regular practices, you can't access data. That's how it is.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be transparent about that, as you said, so that and I think everything that we put out is always very clear to say, where does this come from, right? So where do these insights originate, and what are the limits to these insights based on where they originate, right?
Absolutely. Let's touch a little bit the connectivity of your research. How does AutoNorms engage with formal diplomatic and legal processes? For instance, UN group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapon systems, and how to contextualize those findings that you are working with.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I said, in different ways. So I mean, I think, and there are different forums are kind of susceptible to different types of access. In the case of, for example, the GGE, so the group of governmental experts on laws at the UN in Geneva, they are, compared to many other UN forums, and a comparatively open forum, in the sense that you, as an academic or as a civil society representative, can gain access and can kind of sit there and also deliver statements. right? Of course, you can't vote, right? And you're kind of always on the last on the in the speakers list, because obviously this is still an interstate forum. But you can use that forum to deliver kind of statements, and that was what we have done with the project over the years, So basically, try to package our research findings and integrate them in the sense that they are meaningful for the policymakers there. Then sometimes these forums also call for official submissions of evidence, right? And that can come from national parliaments. It can come from for example, the United Nations General Assembly, where there was also a resolution on lethal autonomous weapon systems that then called for submissions of evidence. So we always kind of use these opportunities to submit officially. But then it's also building networks, right, with diplomats through participating in these kind of forums, right, and basically trying to seek the direct contact, right, to some delegations, and talk to them, not just to use them as sources of information, but also to kind of to kind of package what it is that we are doing in a way that's usable to them. Yeah, and now I'm a member now of the Global Commission on Responsible AI in the Military Domain. So this is actually an initiative funded by the government of the Netherlands that kind of tries to deliver on the basis of inputs received by, I think, maybe 40 members of the commission, right, to deliver some kind of guidance again to policymakers around how to implement this kind of whole responsible AI agenda in the military domain more broadly.
Let's imagine that autonomous weapon systems norms will develop unevenly across regions. Do you anticipate any normative fractures? Do you anticipate that sort of competitive narratives? I'm asking this question because the world is going through a very difficult stage of changing or adjusting international world order.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's already happening, right? So, I mean, I think maybe I can answer the question in a kind of two-part answer. On the one hand, I think that despite all the disagreements, there is this kind of general consensus, as I said, about human control over the use of force and maintaining that, right? But as I already said, that consensus is down to a very ambiguous statement of what it means to have human control. So in a way, that means that although many states agree to this kind of ambiguous statement, they can still kind of continue to perform the kind of practices that they did beforehand, right? Because it's the kind of the broad statement is sometimes flexible enough to accommodate these practices, And I think to some extent, this is what happens with many norms, even kind of hard legal norms, in the sense that there always tends to be a certain ambiguity in them, right? And of course that results from these norms always having been the outcome of some kind of diplomatic compromise, right, and diplomatic negotiation. So I think we see this with the case of autonomous weapon systems too. But then I think what I'm kind of less clear about is how precisely these different countries and maybe kind of spheres, how they are filling the norms with content, and to what extent are they filling the norms with diverging content, right? Because on the one hand, I found that just by there are some practices related to using AI in weapon systems, that are strikingly similar, right? No matter whether the state in question designing the systems is kind of the US or Russia, for example, right? And it has to do with how these kind of technologies work, So there's some of the things are kind of quite similar, but of course then there are some ideas about what is kind of appropriate types of usage, right? And what are appropriate balances between kind of military necessity and human lives that will be different, right, across the countries. And yeah, and of course, then you have the distinct, as you said, kind of legal traditions and cultural traditions influencing how this is perceived, right? So I think it's really a moving puzzle in a sense. And you're right. I think that there's likely going to be more divergence rather than more convergence, right? Although it might seem as if there is still convergence, right? Because this kind of this basic idea of human control is shared.
Those who know norm contestation theory, they always ask a similar question that I'm going to ask, and that's the resistance from actors. For instance, military actors, political leaders, civil societies. So, based on your research, do you see any particular resistance when you are speaking about those norms?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely resistance, right? So there is, I think it's also quite important not to treat, for example, even military actors as a uniform category, right? So it's not as if all military actors think about the use of AI and weapon systems in the same way, right? And they're all kind of following the same line. I think there's great diversity, right? In terms of maybe some actors that are more I know AI curious, right? And some that are more skeptical, right? And that, of course, has an influence on how they think about what are appropriate practices. Um, I think in terms of the civil society, I mean, there's a campaign to stop killer robots that has been active since the beginning of this topic entering the international agenda, and they are. I mean, that it's a strong international coalition of NGOs, right? And they very clearly kind of say, okay, that we have to prohibit systems that are completely outside of human control, right? And then we have to regulate systems that maybe have some human control, right? But we should still be kind of very careful about the type of use cases that we can use them in, right? Or that they should be used in. But for me, but you still have very much this kind of focus on, okay, is there human control? Is there not human control? And I think that they're right. This is a fundamental point. But as I said, right, so I wish these actors would look a bit more closely. Is okay, but if we have human control, is this actually a qualitatively high version of human control that we have? So I think we need to look a lot more at this kind of how are these kind of key principles implemented, right? And what do they really mean in practice? And I think some actors also moving in this kind of direction, you know. So, for example, there's this idea that maybe we should look at not human control, but how using AI and weapon systems affects the exercise of human agency more broadly, right? So how this kind of shapes the human decision-making space in ways that can be quite restrictive, right? So I think there's a lot more happening, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we are not only talking about autonomous weapon systems anymore, but about AI and autonomy much more broadly, right? In all kinds of decision-making contexts related to the military domain. And I mean, as we've seen by kind of recent events, for example, in the Israel-Hamas war, right? So where actually the problem was not, right, so that we had some kind of autonomous weapon systems being used, but it was about AI being integrated in military targeting decision making that was the problem, right?
Is there any connectivity of your research to deterrence? I'm asking this because, in many ways, people can imagine autonomous weapon systems as a strong base or foundation for future theoretical research about deterrence and autonomous weapon systems.
I mean, it's not really something that I have investigated, this deterrence issue, I have to say. And I also think there's this I mean, I feel that there's this kind of connection to what some people refer to as the AI arms race, right? So
I
that kind
see.
of this idea, right? So that if you have the edge on AI, right? So that somehow or you always have to maintain that edge, right? To be able to win that race. And I think that's not a very helpful way of thinking about things. Yeah, because I think it's for me, I guess I'm just kind of looking at kind of different kinds of questions, right? So around not around whether because I think that kind of the deterrence point is a very kind of typical realist assumption in a sense, right? So if you have the possession of a certain cutting edge critical technology, right, or if you have the edge in that, then you're going to be the winning party in any kind of war that could ensue. But I think that's kind of it's. I mean, first of all, it's very hard to kind of precisely, I would say, measure who is winning, right? So what kind of, I mean, because we've seen very different measures attempted, to see who's kind of winning at the moment, right? And I don't think any of these measures are perfect. And then it also assumes, I think there's so many assumptions based around that, right? So speculating about a consistently high rate of technological progress, for example, right? So that anything that can't be solved now can maybe be solved in the future, technologically speaking, which I think is quite dubious. Because we just don't know, right? It's kind of just speculation at this point. And we know from the development of these technologies that they have always been kind of ups and downs, right? So it will not go up all the time, So
When we speak about research and Denmark, we must touch the European Union. And my question is about, as now we see sort of fragmented leadership of European Union, is there a comprehensive sort of holistic research program in the European Union about the norms, or the university you work for is sort of unique in this research?
I mean, I would say if you look about that norms more broadly, right? So then I think typically, as we all know in international relations, right? So there's kind of a big divide between kind of how international relations is broadly done in the US and in Europe, right? And then also other, of course, regions of the world kind of influenced by different traditions, obviously. But I think that although kind of the first kind of norm research scholars were really mainly based in the US. So we had this kind of early constructivist, like Martha Finnemore, Catherine Sicking, these kinds of people. Then if we look at norm research now, most of the scholars are based in Europe, incidentally, many are German, so I don't really know why. But if you kind of map most of the people who are kind of key voices in norm research, such as Antje Wiener, for example, right? Nicole Deitelhoff, Lisbeth Zimmermann, I mean, these are all Germans, right? So I think there's something quite interesting there, right? Um, and um, and of course, then you have kind of the odd researcher in other places, such as myself, although I'm also German, right? Um, but I think I feel like it's kind of more useful to I sometimes I don't know how to put this. And there are also different traditions within these people within this group of people who do norm research, right? So I think and I find that some of them um, um, their priority is really to just kind of do pure academic research, right? And it's about developing models and developing new ways of thinking about norms, but not necessarily trying to intervene in a particular empirical policy area, right? Yeah. So I don't really know whether the fragmentation of Europe can really be connected to I think norm research in Ireland, not the way I see it at least, So yeah.
Was there anything that really surprised you when you submitted your proposal and then when you were researching and when you are researching this topic? Because this is very common that you have sort of idea about research, but once after 1 or 2 years of researching the topic, there might be element that really surprise you. And this element is 99% of time very useful and it's usually implemented in the research outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I would say one of the elements maybe that surprised me was that how we tend to think about this kind of phenomenon of autonomy, autonomous weapon systems, AI as something quite current, right, and something very new. And of course, it is that to some extent. But I also find that in order to really understand kind of where some of the practices that I was studying originate and what kind of shaped these in fundamental ways, I had to go much further back into history than I was thinking about, in the early stages of the project. And I think that kind of historical trajectory of how these kind of the integration of these technologies started a lot earlier, right, than we think, and already has begun to shape the exercise of human control, human agency for much longer than has been visible, right, or has been publicly visible. This, for me, was kind of quite surprising, and that sometimes you would read texts from kind of critical computer scientists from the 1950s or 60s, right, and they would be completely relevant to what it is that you're studying now in 2024, and kind of would express these kind of sentiments, right? Between kind of how is kind of human control, oversight, or agency, how it's kind of compromised, right? Or how it's kind of delimited, right, by working with technology. I think that's quite interesting, right? Because you think, okay, this must be something new, but actually the trajectories of that are much longer. Yeah.
The last question for today's interview is about new voices in the research. There might be people who are interested in this particular topic. What would be your recommendation how those people can start? And maybe you can name one or two sort of under-research area in autonomous weapon systems and norms research.
For me, a basic and kind of under-researched source of inspiration is really this role of technologies, right? And AI is a technology, but also not only AI, right, but also other technologies. And I find that that there is a lot to be gained from kind of looking, as I said, right. So even at these kind of at this broad area of science and technology studies, right, but then also at how kind of relationship between humans and technology has evolved, right, over the course of the last decades. And there are even these kind of these more technical disciplines such as human-computer interaction, right, or human factor analysis, I think very, very, very relevant, and can be very inspiring. But then of course I should say that all of these kind of fundamental questions, I find that this what I maybe is also surprising is that you tend to sometimes also become aware of the limits to your own discipline. So that of course I'm always kind of connecting it back to kind of IR issues, such as norms and governance, right? But then also sometimes you encounter these kind of questions that are fundamentally interesting, but maybe not necessarily only within the confines of IR, right? But I think all of these kind of mid-level theories, like about theorizing technology, theorizing agency, are kind of really, really interesting and useful. And it's also, and I would kind of maybe my advice would be also not to be to think of yourself as too confined by what are the established kind of parameters of the discipline, but also try to push at the boundaries of that discipline. Because I think that's where the most interesting kind of theories or understandings or insights kind of happen.
It's just fascinating topic, and I think many people can find sort of interdisciplinary overlap over there as well between legal studies, security studies, international relations theories, and others. So, Professor Bode, many thanks for your insightful thoughts, for sharing your research and potential research outcomes that we will be reading about in 2 years or 1 year, depends on how the publications will be online. So again, it's great to speak about this topic, and I think we might inspire some more researchers to join this research and have a good competition and excellent research outcomes. Again, thank you for being on IO Thinker.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.